So Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has abruptly canceled a meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. They were supposed to hold talks in Berlin today. The U.S. cited international security issues for bailing, and that's according to Reuters. The visit was originally part of his overseas trip that began in Finland yesterday. However, Pompeo will be making time to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov in Sochi next week, and he may also speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Pompeo has been critical of Russian action around the world, especially in Venezuela, but President Trump said President Putin told him on a phone call that Russia was not looking to get involved. All right, so CBS News State Department reporter Christina Ruffini is following the very latest from Washington. So first off, Christina, we're going to start with this idea of canceling the meeting with Angela Merkel. Germany is an ally of ours, but somehow making time for a Russian diplomat. Maybe they're two separate things. Maybe they're not. Explain what's going on here.
Yeah, I'm not sure one is necessarily related to the other. The secretary canceled what was always planned to be a brief stop in Germany today due to, quote, pressing issues, according to the State Department. At this hour, it's unclear what exactly that issue is, although, as you know, on Sunday, the NSC announced that the Pentagon would be moving this carrier and a bomber group closer to Iran after what we're hearing were credible threats against U.S. forces in the Middle East. The secretary was scheduled to go next to the United Kingdom, and the U.S. Embassy in Britain says those meetings are still on. So currently, where in the world is Mike Pompeo? I guess we'll have to stay tuned.
That is fascinating. So you brought up something I want to ask you about. The U.S. has been putting pressure on Iran for months, called the maximum pressure campaign, they're calling it, canceling oil waivers and increasing sanctions. Was this threat from Iran a response to that policy?
Most likely, yes. Look, Iran's economy is already in recession, due in part to international and U.S. sanctions. The Trump administration, since the president came into office, has been incredibly hard on Iran. They pulled out of the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and reimposed even unilateral sanctions on Iran. Then more recently, the State Department suspended oil waivers for countries like Turkey and India to buy Iranian oil without fear of getting those secondary sanctions from the U.S. And that's a huge hit to Iran's biggest source of income, oil revenue it desperately needs to keep its economy from collapsing. Senior State Department officials and Western diplomatic sources tell me that this shows that Iran is scared and the maximum pressure campaign is working. But they also admitted that things with Iran could get worse before they get better, if in fact they ever actually do.
So let's talk about Pompeo meeting with the Russian foreign minister. He met with the Russian foreign minister, Sergey Lavrov, yesterday in Finland. He had a bit to say about that. We're going to talk about it on the other side. Let's hear what he had to say.
I made clear our view that the Venezuelans deserve a democracy that doesn't have any foreign party running their country or involved in their country on a consistent basis in a military way, right? So we want the Cubans out, we want the Iranians out, we want Russia's military out. We had that conversation, and we started to talk about how our interests might be able to find a way forward. I don't know that we'll get to the right place, but we'll have further conversations.
So at issue here is the support that Russia appears to be lending towards Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, while the United States and other allies are supporting Juan Guaido. We had heard, and in fact you talked to us about this, about both China and Russia getting involved in the conflict in Venezuela, whether providing support or possibly even a small number of troops. So could we be seeing this? Could we be seeing Pompeo maybe hammering out a deal with Lavrov and Russia to get them to maybe ease off of their influence in Venezuela?
I think that seems unlikely. I think if you listen to that answer where Pompeo says, I don't know that we'll get to the right place, that's Diplo speak, in my opinion, for it's probably not going to happen. Look, the two big players that the U.S. keeps blaming for this problem in Venezuela are the Russians and the Cubans. And Vladimir Putin does not like to give ground to the U.S. anywhere in the world. Venezuela is playing out a bit like an old Cold War proxy game. You've got Russia, you've got America, like I said, you've even got Cuba, all trying to do what they can to exert influence on a foreign country that's not particularly close geographically to any of the three. Russia and Cuba, as you mentioned, are backing Maduro, and the U.S. is backing upstart interim President Juan Guaido. All we need are some smoke-filled rooms and a reboot of Dr. Strangelove, and the nostalgia can be complete. Could the U.S. and Russia come to an agreement? I guess it's possible. But I'd put my money on both countries digging in and sticking to their sides until somebody decides to take that to the next level. That next level would most likely involve some sort of military intervention, although the U.S. has said they want to exhaust all diplomatic measures first.
Yeah, I can imagine. Christina, the secretary just left meetings of the Arctic Council, of which Russia is a member. Did they agree on anything there? And what was the overall message coming out of those meetings?
So there are 5 members of this Arctic Council. You've got Canada, Russia, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, and they all issued a joint statement about the meeting, reinforcing cooperation and security in the Arctic. The statement did not, however, mention the environment. In fact, yesterday, the day this huge UN report came out about talking about biodiversity on the planet and how it's reaching kind of a critical moment, I think it said in that report we could be losing half of the species in our oceans, et cetera, if we don't change course. Secretary Pompeo actually gave a speech on the outside of that meeting where he said the region was filled with economic potential and opportunity, and that the melting ice could potentially open up new trade routes to cut the time between China and the West. Now, in fairness, the secretary has talked about the environment in the Arctic and the need to protect it, especially in reference to China. China has tried to gain a foothold in the Arctic, something Pompeo says it shouldn't be allowed to do because, number one, China doesn't actually have an Arctic border, and two, it has a history of environmental degradation. A senior State Department official said reporters shouldn't read too much into the fact that there was a joint statement and not a communique, which is typically to come out of these meetings, or the fact that that statement doesn't mention the environment. He said just because you don't have a certain phrase, don't infer that the United States has taken some sort of position that's anti-environment. They called reports that the U.S. didn't want to sign a more official document because it would have mentioned environmental issues. They called it, your favorite phrase and mine, Anne-Marie, fake news.
Fake news, of course. Christina Ruffini, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.